Good evening. My name is Rob Leyden. I'm a Director Emeritus here at this center, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the 10th Chatham Marconi Speaker Series presentation of 2025. Tracing the 50-year history of the Chatham Railroad from 1887 to 1937, our program tonight will address the railroad's key role in the mobility of Chatham's residents and the advancement of the town's economy. Photographs from the Railroad Museum's collection will illustrate the stations on the line, the equipment used, the route of the railroad, and its connection to the National Railroad system. Gil will be joined by Rick Jenkins of the Chatham Railroad Museum staff. A lifelong railroad enthusiast, Gil Sparks is a retired Delaware corporate lawyer. Since 2021, he's been co-director of the Chatham Railroad Museum after serving a number of years as a volunteer. Among the many leadership positions Gil held during his career are chairman of the Delaware State Board of Bar Examiners, Corporation Law Committee of the Business Law Section of the American Bar Association, Corporation Law Section of the Delaware Bar Association, Tulane Corporate Law Institute, and Board of Trustees of the University of Delaware. He's a graduate of Yale University and the University of Pennsylvania, receiving an honorary degree from the University of Delaware. He was awarded the Order of the First Estate by the Governor of Delaware. He met his wife of 55 years in Chatham and has had a second home in town for 35 years. Following his presentation, Gil will answer your questions. And it's now my pleasure to introduce Gil Sparks.
Thank you. So the only correction I have to that is I've been married to my wife, who's in the back row, for 57 years. And interestingly, we met here at the Rotary, for those of you who may have remembered when it had a Howard Johnson's at the Rotary. And I was teaching tennis at Camp Viking in Orleans, and her family had a house here, and just by chance we met, and it's worked out pretty well so far. So on with the business of the day. So in 1854, something called the Cape Cod Railroad completed its original line from Hyannis and Yarmouth to Middleborough, where it connected with the Old Colony and Newport Railroad, which provided service to Boston. So I'm not allowed to point at the map, but if you look at the upper left, you can see Middleborough. There you go. And you track on down, keep going. That's where the canal is today, and the railroad to this day branches off at the canal. One part went due south to Falmouth and Woods Hole. It only goes about halfway now. And the other part went down, the arrow's following now, it turns left, and it goes to Hyannis. And that was the part that was built in 1854. The railroad was successful, and as early as the late 1850s, the powers that be of the Cape Cod Railroad showed interest in extending it from Yarmouth northward to Orleans and then on to Provincetown. So there were efforts by the Chatham powers that be in those years to have the railroad route the line further east so it was closer to Chatham. But it ultimately, and we can show it on the arrow here, it ultimately passed northwest of Chatham to and a little bit north of Harwich, and then on to Brewster, and then up the spine to Provincetown. It made it to Provincetown in 1864. And from 1864, for the next 23 years, if you go back and look at the newspapers of the time or the history of the time, there was constant schemes promoted by prominent Chatham residents and business people to try to get some sort of branch to make it to Chatham. They talked about narrow gauge railroads, they talked about all sorts of things. Nothing ever happened. So for 23 years, from 1864 to 1887, if you wanted to get to Boston, you would have to first take a 7-mile stagecoach ride. Maybe you ride your horse, but you probably took a stagecoach ride over a bunch of unpaved sandy roads to the Harwich main station, and then you could catch a train to Boston. And the same was true with respect to freight. So if you can imagine the difficulty of transloading freight, like coal, in Harwich and then having to haul it by stagecoach to Chatham, it was primitive, it was expensive, and it was slow. So basically, as an economic matter, and frankly as a societal matter, Chatham was isolated. It was really isolated. And as detailed, and there's a lot of detail, which I'm not going to go into on all those schemes, but there's a wonderful book on Cape Cod railroads. There's one chapter on the Chatham Railroad, but there's chapters on every railroad, including ones on Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard. They actually had railroads for a little while. And this goes into some detail about all those discussions. And at the museum, goes a pen. At the museum, we actually have a handwritten letter to the board of the select board at that time, Board of Selectmen, in 1873, talking about trying to get the Board of Selectmen to get behind some sort of railroad to Chatham. So we move forward, and finally, in early 1887, something called the Chatham Railroad was formed. Now, between 1854 and 1887, the Cape Cod Railroad had been taken over by the Old Colony and Newport Railroad. In Chatham, there was an initial issuance of 682 shares, $1,000 a share, which was a lot of money in that time. In fact, roughly 33 times, if you multiply that by 33, it would be $33,000 roughly today. So of the 62,200 shares, the town of Chatham, which had a real interest in this railroad, bought 310 of those shares. And Marcellus Eldridge, he of the Eldridge Library, with his home on Watch Hill at the end of Main Street, purchased 50 shares and was one of the largest individual shareholders. And he's the same Eldridge who later gifted the library to the town. So he became the president. And there he is. He made his fortune. His father started it, and he took it over with the largest brewery, or second largest brewery in New Hampshire and Massachusetts, and brought that money back to Chatham. I mean, he was mayor of Portsmouth. He sat on the New Hampshire legislature, but he always held Chatham close to his heart. And this railroad, I do not think, would have been built but for him. I can just imagine at the time, here's a powerful, wealthy business person with Chatham's interests at heart, and some of his own, as I'll get to in a minute. And he drove this thing, after 23 years, he drove it very quickly to a reality. So by 1887, we have this, they also sold bonds. They needed $100,000 to build this railroad. And so they sold $29,500 in bonds. Add that to the $68,200, and you get enough money to build the railroad. And after they decided to build it in the spring of 1887, it got built in 6 months. I mean, apparently there were about 150 Italian immigrant laborers came, and they worked all summer, and they built the railroad. And ground was broken on May 24, 1887, and the railroad opened on November 21st, 1887. And this was it's like the 4th of July in Chatham when this railroad opened. Schools all went out, bells would ring, and they had free rides back and forth from Chatham to Harwich all day. And then they had a ball in the evening. And we have in our collection the dance order of the ball. And I've always found this, again, I'm not allowed to point, but you can point. You start with a quadrille, Well, nobody knows what that is anymore. But the waltz, maybe some of us could, oh, here we go. That's the quadrille. And then we had a waltz, and then you had a Virginia reel, and then you went on and you had, I don't know, I couldn't even pronounce whatever that number 6 is, number 7 and on. And so this was a big, big deal. Now we have an estimate. This was the estimate that was used in terms of where the money was going to be spent. Now they actually brought the railroad in, as we'll see and later on in the program. They brought it in at a little bit under that 102,300. They brought it in roughly at 99 too. But you can see the type of work that was required. Clearing the roadbed, excavation, ballasting, drains and culverts, superstructure, steel rail. Steel rail is interesting, by the way. Steel rail was 50 pounds. A Class 1 railroad in the United States today has 134-pound rail. So this was before its time what you would call light rail. Trains didn't go very fast on the Chatham Railroad. And even then, I mean, the major railroads would have heavier rail than that. Stations and platforms. So we're going to get to how many stations there were, but they built a lot of stations and a lot of platforms for $3,500. And we're going to show you the engine and the car house. You can remember they cost $750. A water station, that's a windmill to pump water so you could feed the steam engines. A turntable. And then they have some engineering costs, some fencing, land damages. I think that must mean they had to probably pay people to build the railroad through their pasture, and contingencies. And maybe they cut down on the contingencies, and maybe that's how they saved a couple $1,000s. But that's how it got started. So the stations, you know the station, our station, the station, it's been the same place all along, and somehow has survived. And we'll go into a little story of that near the end of the presentation. But we have that station. Then we had a station in South Chatham. That is at the corner of what is now Route 28 and 137. Catholic Church would be behind it, a little bit behind it. Also note the type of railroad crossing that they've got. There are 12 railroad crossings on this line. All of them unguarded. And we do at the museum have the whistle posts that they used. So you give a long and 2 shorts when you're approaching a crossing, a pedestrian or a road crossing. But that was the only sort of safety you had other than stopping. And also you can notice that those crossing signs, you've never seen one quite like that. They became standardized early in the 19th century. At this point in time, railroads all over the country had different models of crossing signs. So it wasn't until later that you got the crossbuck sign that we're all familiar with. The crossbuck was designed to be to remind people of pirates and danger. And somehow that became, as the country federalized, ultimately there were uniform standards, and that's what we ended up with. But you learn so much from each of these pictures as you go forward. So then the next station was in South Harwich. So back when I started giving these lectures, I decided I better go find where these places were. So if you turn right at Bucas, that's Depot Road. And then you get to the rail trail. And the station, there's nothing there now, or whatever there's now doesn't resemble the station, but it would have been on the left side of the road in the, what I guess we would call the 9 to noon quadrant of the intersection of the rail trail. And that route, that road. They built a car house, an engine house, a freight house, the windmill, and a turntable located roughly where the firehouse is today. So here's a diorama. This is in the museum, and this is the the most extraordinary thing, other than the fact that we have the museum and it never burned down and it never got vandalized and it's been kept up precisely, pristinely. But this diorama has a wonderful story to it. And I don't know exactly when it was built, maybe 10 or 15, 20 years ago, maybe longer than that. This is the 65th anniversary year of the museum. Somewhere along the line, they got hold of, and it's now in the Atwood Museum archives, an exhibit that was attached to a brief that was filed by the Nickerson Lumber Company. You can see the Nickerson Lumber Company there, who sued the railroad after the railroad stopped running trains. And they said, we want out of our lease. We're here, and we have this building to get lumber, and you're not bringing it anymore, and we want out of this. And they put a schematic as an exhibit to that brief. So Seth Hoyt, who I've never had the pleasure of meeting, unfortunately, or never did, had the benefit of that. So he was able to lay out precisely everything that was in the yard. And then he went around to townspeople who had a memory of what color the buildings were and got them to describe the colorings of the buildings. So if you look at this, and I'm going to ask Rick to help you. We already pointed out Nickerson. I'm not sure what that building is behind that. I should know, but I don't. There's a coal thing over here, so you get coal, because by this time there's no wood left in Chatham, so you had to have something to heat your house with because all the trees had been chopped down. The next thing is the freight house. Now the freight house is the only other surviving building. It was purchased at auction after the railroad was closed. It is now the mural barn at the Atwood. And of course the station survives. Then over here to the left, that is the end. There's the turntable. That's roughly where the fire station is. That's the engine house, so you could drive the engine in there and keep it in there overnight if you wanted to. And then back here, which we don't see, and this is, by the way, this is all as it was in 1915. As are the timetables that everybody had on their chairs, 1915. For the people who are watching by Zoom, I invite you to come to the museum. We give everybody a timetable and you can get one. That's a plug for the museum. But there was a weld manufacturing at this time off just past that little tiny house up there on the upper left. And it manufactured shells, artillery shells, in the First World War, and was a big employer here in Chatham. So we're going to move on. More stations. 1889, another station was built in West Chatham at the site of today's airport building. And that was to service another Marcellus Eldridge project, which was the Chatham Hotel, which occupied the 4th Fairway and Green at what is now Eastford Home. And this was, and when I said Eldridge had some other interests involved in all of this, he probably knew he was going to build a hotel, and he got the railroad to build him a station to suit the railroad. Now, this is a high-end, 76-room, 3-story hotel with steam heat, bowling alleys, billiard rooms, tennis courts, and bathhouses along the shore. Sounds great. It was developed by Eldridge and a group of Boston businessmen, including Jordan Marsh of retail fame. Unfortunately, in 1893, for those of you who have studied economics, there was something they called the Panic of 1893. It was a big-time bubble-bursting recession. And this hotel had 2 things going against it. Number one, it was catering to high-income Bostonians, mainly, who would come by train. And you still had to go from the airport all the way out to where Eastward Ho is on undeveloped roads on a rough stagecoach ride. And those things did it in, and it only lasted 4 years. And by 1896, it was being vandalized. Eldridge took some of the furniture and put it in his house. And he ultimately opened another hotel called the Dillard House, which became the Manasquan Inn, which was around here until 1956. and he brought a bunch of other stuff from this hotel. But then the hotel was demolished, sold to a real estate developer, and somewhere in the history, if you ever do a history of the Eastward Ho Golf Course, somewhere along the way they bought that property, and that's what we have today. So what happened to the station? Well, it was brand new. They had just built it. So they loaded it on a boxcar, and they shipped it off, and it became the Harwich Center station. Now, why do you need a station in Harwich Center if you've got a Harwich station? Well, when the railroad came, railroads love straight lines. And so they didn't even bend to go into Harwich Center. They just went sort of up the coast on their way to Brewster and then on the way up to Provincetown. So the Harwich Station is about a mile from what we call Harwich Center. So they had a station stop, and then they had a station. Not this one. That's the main Harwich Station, and that is, of course, on the line that goes from Provincetown down across the bridge up to Middleborough and on to Boston. And that's where you go on your shuttle train back and forth from Chatham to change trains to go to Boston. Now, for most of its existence, and those of you who have a timetable can look at this, but I will describe it for the benefit of those who don't. There were 4 passenger trains every day but Sunday. The train did not run on Sunday. But every other day, it ran from Chatham to Harwich, back and forth. The line was 7 miles long. It took 20 minutes to get to Harwich. You've seen the stations that it stopped at. Also, it continued to have, even though there was no station there, West Chatham continued to be a whistle stop, which meant that if somebody was there with a flag, they could stop the train, or if somebody wanted to get off and told the conductor, it would stop and let you off there. But I doubt that happened very often. It cost 35 cents to go from Chatham to Harwich, which is about $11 today. Probably about the same you'd pay to take an Uber today. And you would make your connection in Harwich, and then you would have a 91-mile trip to Boston that took roughly, when you added in the time from leaving Chatham to the time you get to Boston, 3.5 hours. So you could make it to Boston if you took the 7 o'clock train, or whatever that earliest train is on the timetable. In fact, I have one here myself, so I'll just look at that. You could catch the 6:30 a.m. train and get to Boston at 9:57, and then you could catch the train, the 4:31 train, and get back to Chatham at 7:55. So if you wanted to, you wouldn't have a whole lot of time, but you'd have 3 or 4 hours in Boston to do business, get on the train, come back. Now, upon its founding, a couple other things about this fare. Each of the leases, the one they signed in 1893 with the Old Colony, which I'll get to in a minute, and the one that was subsequently signed and renewed with the New Haven, had the 35-cent fare fixed. That never changed the whole time. It never got bigger than that. And I think there were some commutation fares and stuff if you were going to going to school and you wanted to catch the train in South Chatham and get to Chatham. But that never changed. So when we think of inflation, they weren't thinking about inflation back in 1887. They weren't even thinking about it in 1905 when the lease was renewed with the New Haven. They were just this inflation this difference between 35 cents and $11 has all basically occurred, and most of it in our respective lifetimes, along with the various world wars, but the Second World War in particular. So upon its founding, the Chatham Railroad was leased to the Old Colony. Remember I told you the Old Colony had purchased the Cape Cod Railroad, so they were the person you would lease it to. And they had purchased that, by the way, in 1872, not too long before the Cape Cod Railroad, or to the Chatham Railroad came into existence. And the New Haven Railroad, which was sucking up every rail asset, every trolley asset, every steamboat asset, every bus asset that they could in New England to create a monopoly, they bought the Old Colony in 1893. and the lease was assumed by the New Haven Railroad. And then in early 1900s, they renewed it. Really, they renewed it because the New Haven wanted to invest some money in the infrastructure of the railroad, and they didn't want the Chatham Railroad to cancel it. So they renewed, but on the same terms with the same 35-cent fee. And the deal was that the New Haven, or the Old Colony before it, would supply everything. The personnel to run the trains, the rolling stock, the passenger cars and the freight cars, the engines, the maintenance, everything. There was nothing, there were no employees of the Chatham Railroad. In return for that, 30% of the revenue gotten from the railroad, from the Old Colony or the New Haven, was paid to the Chatham Railroad. So basically, all they had to do throughout the whole life of the railroad was to collect the revenue, and I'll have a sheet near the end which will sort of show how much that was. Then they would have to pay taxes, so they'd have to write a check for taxes. Occasionally they would pay a dividend, and they had to pay the interest and ultimately the principal on the $29,500 worth of bonds that I told you about a little earlier. Now, in the turret of the museum, by the way, it's perilous to go up the stairway to the turret of the museum. We don't let people do that. We do have a picture there so you could see, but everybody wants to go up. What's up there? Well, 80% of it is what your grandfather's attic would have looked like, the kind that had the boards, and if you were afraid that if you stepped on it, your foot would go through the... that actually happened once in a house. This is a real aside, but we had a friend who was going up to get some Christmas lights that we were going to loan them, and he ended up sticking his foot through the attic into the room below. Well, that's the kind of attic that this one is, except in the turret, they've finished it. And so you can imagine the treasurer once or twice a year climbing up those stairs and going into this little office in the turret and writing 5 or 6 checks, pay taxes, and maybe they had to pay somebody else something. They weren't paying wages. And then as time went on, they also paid some dividends. One of the things, if I ever do this lecture again, the next thing I'm going to do is figure out how many dividends they paid and when they paid them. But it was a profitable venture, but I'm not sure. But nobody really got rich holding shares of the Chatham Railroad. So it was an immediate success. This railroad was an immediate success. In 1891, it carried 23,000 passengers. And that was pretty much the case from the day it opened up until the First World War, and probably including the First World War. So let's see. What do we got there? We got a picture of this would be an early picture of the railroad. This is because we don't have any cars yet. Those are the taxis that you would get when you got to the railroad. And we have actually the halter of one of the horses in the museum for these taxis, and we have a picture of the main taxi driver. Okay, let's go to the next one. Now, back in the very beginning, when we started, you would have seen a picture of the station with an engine. That engine had a big funnel on it. That was a wood-burning engine. So in the very early years, they were still burning wood, and later they shifted to coal, and the engines are more what you would recognize, not as a modern steam engine, because there's no such thing as a modern steam engine, but as the steam engine that we would probably all remember seeing. And I've always thought that the most impressive statistic in terms of what this railroad meant to the tourism industry in Chatham and also to the connectivity of people was in 1886, which was for the July 4th celebration, because Chatham apparently has always had July 4th celebrations. 400 people came by stagecoach from the Harwich station to Chatham to participate in that. In 1888, the first year that they had the train, 1,600 people came. So there was, just in terms of you can look at all these facts and figures, but just in terms of human activity, that is just a dramatic change in terms of Chatham's economy. Now, in addition to the numbers, over the years in the station, and maybe somebody even here today will have a similar story. We've heard stories, oh, my grandmother commuted from South Chatham to the elementary school or to the high school by train. Took the train, got on the train in South Chatham, and rode it into Chatham, walked down through what would now be Veterans Field and went to high school and then we had somebody else come in and said, oh, my mother who lived in Chatham took the train every day to Hyannis to go to normal school, which was basically a teacher's college in Hyannis. So this was, at a human level, this was liberating for the people of Chatham. Now, just as important was the freight aspect of all of this. So what was happening? What was happening now? Well, first you get better mail service and express service. That's clear. But you're getting lumber, you're getting grain, you're getting groceries, you're getting stone for shore protection, you're getting steel for the Naval Air Station in the First World War, and I do not have an actual receipt, but I would bet my life that the steel for the Marconi's transmission towers and the bricks for this building came in by rail. Gasolines, lubricants, later on road asphalt, which was sort of the railroad is helping to assume its own doom, a little like the New Haven did when it had to ship stuff to build the Connecticut Turnpike. Coal, which was a big deal. The electrical material for wiring Chatham, because when this railroad started, Chatham did not have electricity. And we have a slide here, next one. Well, let's see, let's do the merchandise out. I think we had a Nickerson lumber, oh, there it is. So there's the type of engine that after the wood burning one with a big funnel, this is the type of engine you would have seen for most of the life of the railroad. And that engine is switching the Nickerson lumber facility, which I showed you earlier. Outgoing stuff, what was going out? Fresh fish. Now you can get fish to Boston in half the time that you could get it there before. Salted fish, shellfish, cranberries. And then, as I mentioned before, you can see some of the detail here. That Weld Manufacturing Company was constructed next to the depot and made artillery shells. They were shipped out, and that employed 140 people, and they wouldn't have been employed but for the railroad. So let's go to the next one. So this is an interesting document that we've uncovered as we poke around in archives, and I continue to try to give these talks as we learn more. They get a little better and a little longer each time. But this gives you a pretty good picture of what this railroad was, how it was run. So you get the income from the lease of the road. That's $2,953. Now don't forget, these are $1,892. So you can multiply that by 33, I don't know, whatever the difference is, whatever $35 to $11 is, that's like 33. You multiply that number by 33. And they had a little store somewhere. I don't know, maybe it was in the station. That brought in a little extra money. So you get $3,000 and change. Then your salaries and maintenance of the organization. Well, they weren't paying anybody any salary. So maintenance would be things like paper and supplies and the ledgers that you see that we've got in the station. Then they have interest on those two bonds that I told you about. And then they have to pay taxes. So you deduct that and you find out that they made $886 in the fiscal year ending June 30, 1892. And then you look at what the total surplus is, and you say, well, they've been pretty much making that every year. So if you take the 4 years or so of operation that preceded it, and they're up to a surplus of $2,938.06. My guess is there's nothing on here that talks about dividends, so I don't think they had started to pay dividends yet. But as time went on, they did, as they built up their surplus. Let's go ahead to the, flip down a little bit to the balance sheet. There you can see the cost of the road, $99,151.08. A little bit under that $102,000 itemized estimate that they got. And then they had a store. I don't know anything about the store, but I'm assuming maybe the chiclet machine that we've got in the station was part of the store. And then they had some cash, and then they had money they hadn't yet gotten from the New Haven, or in this case, it was still the old colony. This was the year before the New Haven took over. And it all balances out. We go to the next page. Not a whole lot more on this page that I haven't already mentioned, except for you could see the two bonds. Flip down up a little bit. You've got the I'm looking at for those bonds, a little bit more. So right down there under funded debt. So you've got the first mortgage bonds. Those were due in 1902, rate of interest 6%. And then you've got the other issue, which was a 20-year issue. And that one's, the first was a 15, obviously, and that one's a 6%. And you have the interest that's paid on those, and you can see the total amount of the two bonds. And those were both paid off on schedule on the due dates, November 1902 and November 1907. And that would have freed up a lot of free cash, so I'm assuming that dividends sort of began to flow more liberally after that, until things began to decline. You can also see some detail on the railroad. You've got 7.07 miles of main line track, sidings and other tracks almost a mile, and then you have that interesting 50-pound rail that they're using down at the bottom, which I mentioned earlier is light, probably light even for those times. And then this is interesting. There are 12 grade crossings on this railroad. None of them are protected. In other words, there's no flagman, there are no blinking lights, and all you got is that weird-looking thing, which I assume in the later years they probably standardized it and went to the crossbucks like we have behind the museum. But I just found this to be a very interesting document in terms of just understanding what was going on with this railroad. Now, unfortunately, and I hope I'm running pretty much on time here. This is good, just like a railroad. Unfortunately, all good things have to come to an end. And after World War I, passenger traffic declined as there were paved roads, there were automobiles, there were trucks, and they diverted traffic. And it wasn't helped by the fact that the New Haven was a fiscal mess. I mean, they had over-purchased in an attempt to monopolize all throughout New England. And they started to, every time a lease would expire on any branch line, anywhere pretty much, they would try to get rid of it. And we know that we had an extension until 1937 on the lease for this branch. So even before in 1937, when, to jump ahead a bit, the New Haven refused to renew the lease, the Chatham Railroad had no employees, had no engines, had no cars, had nothing. It had no choice but to liquidate. But even before that, the New Haven, which was already in a lot of difficulty, had cut back. And we did have trucks by then. We did have all these other means of communication and transportation. So by 1927, there were only 2 passenger trains a day each way, instead of the 4 that you saw in 1915. And then that was reduced to 1, and for a railroad purist, the ultimate sort of negative aspect was that was by a rail bus. That was by a gasoline-powered bus that rode on rails. Not even a steam engine, not even a real train, if you will. So go back one. Go back one. That's a slide of an engine in 1932 at the station. Now, by that time, there's no passenger service, so this is a freight. You can see a freight car behind there. They're delivering freight. Probably by this time, Nickerson is the only customer on the line. By the end, they were the only customer on the line. There may have been a few others still, but there wasn't much going on. And that's sort of the engine. That's a mogul. And it's a very typical engine on branch lines on the New Haven. And that would have been the type of engine right up until the end that they were using. So now we're going to go to the next slide. And when I say that traffic is diminishing, this is an interesting picture. First, look at the right-of-way. I mean, you can barely see the track for the weeds. They're not even bothering to turn the engine around. They got a caboose on one end, but they're pulling or pushing the one gondola car, which probably had coal in it, up and down the line. You'll notice that even that on any freight train back in this time, up until 20 years ago, you had to have a caboose. There's a whole other story about why we don't have cabooses anymore. But so you're lugging a caboose on this freight engine with one car on a bunch of track that you can barely see. And anybody who looked at that would say this railroad doesn't have much longer to live. Because by then, the New Haven knew they weren't going to renew the lease in 1937. So they weren't going to put in new rails. They weren't going to reballast. They weren't going to clear the weeds. They were going to do all they could do not to do anything. So on July 2nd, 1937, when the New Haven refused to renew the lease, all operations ceased, just like that. And roughly 50 years after the railroad began, it ended. And that's a dispatch to the Boston Globe with the last locomotive out of Chatham. You see the last engineer, the last fireman, and you could buy the railroad if you wanted it. And what happened? Well, first the track was removed and sold. Almost by October, so they discontinue in July, and by October the track is gone. It's been sold to a buyer in Boston who then sold it overseas. I think the theory is that it then got sold to the Japanese and was converted into a destroyer or something for the Second World War. But I think that they were buying all of our scrap metal in 1937, so that, and in fact, when we stopped selling them scrap metal, that's why they bombed Pearl Harbor. One of the reasons. And oil, but scrap metal and oil were the two things that they were relying on us for. So before we talk, we were talking with some of you, asking some questions, and I'm answering them in the script as we go forward. This is one of them. So what happened? Here we got the Chatham station. It's sitting there, and it's all alone. There's no track. The railroad people wanted out of this business, and they sold everything else they owned other than the rails to a developer, or I don't know what you would call them, somebody in the business of buying assets for cheap and then selling them off piece by piece over time. And I think the firm was from Boston. So they sold the right-of-way, they sold all the stations, including our station. And somehow, from 37 to 43, nobody busted the windows in, nobody burned it down. There apparently it was used as a scrap iron repository, as people would donate scrap iron for the war cause. But it's always, if you look at pictures of what that station looked like, sitting out there sort of all alone, unpainted, it's a miracle that we still have it. And how did that happen? Well, somehow it survived that 6 years, and then a Phyllis Cox and her husband and she were summer people here. He was an industrialist, a significant industrialist in Cleveland, and she had taken a liking to the station. She had, when she was a child, she had come here on the train to the station. She didn't want to see it go, and she bought it, along with a plot of ground around it that still belongs to the station. And then in 1951, she donated it to the town of Chatham, with a proviso that it be maintained. And the select board accepted her donation. And so from that point on, at least, the station was under the protection of the town of Chatham. Now, I don't know how protected that really was, but it was under the protection of the town of Chatham. And things moved along at a normal pace, as they do here in Chatham, and they said, well, all right, finally we're going to have a museum. And in 1960, the town-owned museum, and the museum is still town-owned. We're run by a town committee. We have to do the same stuff that all other town committee people have to do. We have to have 2 meetings a year. We have to pass the ethics test, all that kind of stuff. And that's been the way it's been for 65 years, from 1960 until this year when we celebrated, a couple of weeks ago, we celebrated our 65th anniversary as a museum. Now, when we began, I mentioned, and the town has been, and we get about 6,000 visitors a year. We also take about the same amount of donations in. We use the donations to fund all the things that we do. Those timetables have to be printed. Tickets we give to the kids. Other things, we actually always end up with a surplus. We're probably the only town committee that has a significant surplus. It's fairly significant. But we do have to get it appropriated each year, so when we have projects, we'll go to the town, and they really can't say no because the money is reserved for appropriation, and we're happy to take it when we need it. But it's just hard to understate what this meant to the town of Chatham in terms of the tourist industry. I mean, there would be no Chatham Bars Inn, which was built in 1914, if it wasn't for this railroad. And there would be no brick buildings downtown if it wasn't for this railroad. And it's just many of the buildings that you see downtown, all that stuff was shipped in by the railroad. It is pretty fantastic, and it's also interesting how little survives other than the station and the freight house that I mentioned and showed you that's at the Atwood. But these are about the only things that I could quickly grab in the museum that we know came from the railroad. So, and I'm hoping that people who are online can see these. One of them is a joiner. Those are if you have rails, you put them between the rails and you bolt the rails together with that thing. And it's incredibly heavy. When we're done here, if somebody wants to try to pick it up, it is surprisingly heavy. And the other one is the most amazing thing I think we have in the museum, or one of the most amazing things, other than the museum itself and all the things in the museum that have been preserved since it closed. That is a switch head. Until we found that, I didn't ever realize there was a siding on the railroad. But there was. There was a siding in the vicinity of the South Chatham Station at the corner of 137 and 28. And it went off up to be sort of behind where the Catholic Church is and into the hinterlands. I've never gone back there, but I'm told some people have. There's a sand pit there. And the sand that was in that pit was apparently exactly the type of sand that locomotives would carry to blow under the rails on slippery times in the fall when the leaves are on the rails, or in the winter when there's ice on the rails. And so periodically, the New Haven Railroad would back a couple of gondola cars into that sand pit on this siding, fill them up with sand and haul them off to be used for sand, for locomotives. Now that's pretty much my prepared remarks. And I think it does answer some of the questions that people had before we got here, which is a little bit gratifying. But I'm happy to answer questions either from the audience or from the Zoom audience if you've got any.
We have Tom Scott asks, how was the right of way from Harwich acquired?
Good question. I'm sure it was acquired by what we know today as eminent domain. In other words, you would have bought it. The government would have forced you to sell it, just like they do when they build a road. And I don't think people got paid very much for that, because as you saw, the total amount that was paid for land was like $1,500. So I think with the power of law behind you, you can drive a pretty stiff bargain.